Gentlemen, what I'm about to walk you through represents one of the most surgically executed counterintelligence operations on Latin American soil in the past 2 decades. This is the forensic SITREP on what we're internally designating as Operation Broken Vault, the joint FBI-SEBIN takedown of Alex Saab and Raúl Gorrín in Caracas on February 4, 2026. Before we dissect the tactical execution, let's establish baseline understanding of the primary target. Alex Saab wasn't just another sanctions-evading financier. He functioned as the financial nervous system of the Maduro regime. Every offshore account, every shell corporation registered in the UAE, every crypto wallet moving Venezuelan oil revenue through Turkish intermediaries, Saab had architectural access to it all. He wasn't the money, he was the routing protocol. By early 2026, Saab had constructed what he believed to be an impenetrable operational security posture in Caracas. His primary residence in the Cerro Verde district wasn't just a mansion, it was a hardened facility that would make most embassy RSOs jealous. Russian electronic warfare countermeasures, Chinese biometric access control systems, a Cuban-trained personal security detail with direct communication links to SEBIN command. On paper, this compound represented a multi-layered defense architecture that should have provided at least 45 minutes of early warning for any breach attempt. The confidence wasn't just Saab's. The entire financial apparatus surrounding Maduro, Gorrín, the Oberto brothers, Alejandro Andrade, they all operated under the assumption that Caracas in 2026 was a sanctuary. U.S. law enforcement hadn't successfully executed an arrest operation inside Venezuelan territory since the early 2000s. The operational calculus was simple. As long as you stayed within Venezuelan borders and maintained good relations with SEBIN, you were untouchable. That calculus was wrong. What happened on February 4th wasn't a breach, it was a managed betrayal. And the architect of that betrayal was sitting in Miraflores Palace the entire time. Delcy Rodriguez, Executive Vice President of Venezuela, the second most powerful political figure in the regime, and the woman who had just decided that Alex Saab had become a liability. This wasn't about justice. This wasn't about international law. This was about internal power consolidation, executed through a carefully orchestrated digital decapitation. And the weapon wasn't American surveillance technology or CIA penetration assets. The weapon was the SEBIN itself, turned against its own protected asset by the very people who were supposed to guarantee his safety. Let me walk you through exactly how this happened. The foundation of Operation Broken Vault wasn't laid in Langley or at FBI headquarters in Washington. It was laid in a series of encrypted back-channel communications between Delcy Rodriguez's personal legal team and specific FBI liaison officers operating through intermediaries in Bogotá and Panama City. The timeline we've reconstructed through SIGINT and subsequent HUMINT debriefs puts the initial contact at approximately November 2025. Now, understanding the why requires understanding the internal power dynamics that were fracturing the Maduro regime's financial architecture at that time. By late 2025, Alex Saab had become what we'd call a single point of failure. He controlled too much, he knew too much, and more critically, from Delcy's perspective, he represented the old guard, the network of Colombian and Lebanese fixers who had built the sanctions evasion infrastructure back in 2017 and 2018. Delcy was consolidating a new network, younger, more technologically sophisticated, less dependent on personal relationships and more dependent on algorithmic money movement through decentralized finance protocols. Saab wasn't just redundant, he was a threat. His network represented institutional memory that could be weaponized against the new power structure. Every time Delcy's team wanted to restructure a financial channel or redirect oil revenue streams, they had to negotiate with Saab's network. That's not power consolidation, that's dependency. And Delcy doesn't do dependency. The tactical genius of what she engineered is that she didn't just eliminate Saab. She used the United States government to do it, thereby immunizing herself from internal blowback. If SEBIN had arrested Saab directly, it would have triggered immediate suspicion and potential retaliation from his network and his Colombian backers. But if the FBI executed the arrest, if it looked like an American intelligence penetration, then Delcy could position herself as the person working to prevent future compromises. She could purge the old guard while appearing to strengthen security. The back-channel protocol worked like this. Delcy's legal intermediaries, we've identified at least 2 Miami-based attorneys with historical ties to Venezuelan government officials, made contact with FBI personnel assigned to the Venezuela portfolio. The offer was straightforward. Delcy would provide actionable intelligence on Saab's location, his security protocols, and the technical specifications of his defensive infrastructure. In exchange, the FBI would execute the arrest in a manner that appeared to be the result of American signals intelligence and physical surveillance, with no indication of internal Venezuelan cooperation. But here's where it gets tactically elegant. Delcy didn't just provide intelligence. She provided access. Real, operational access to SEBIN command and control systems. Because the FBI wasn't going to attempt a kinetic breach of a hardened compound in Caracas without absolute certainty that they could neutralize the defensive perimeter. That certainty came in the form of master access keys to the compound's electronic security grid, keys that could only come from SEBIN itself. Now let's talk about the risk calculus from the FBI's perspective. This wasn't a straightforward decision. Accepting operational support from a Venezuelan government official, even through intermediaries, creates massive counterintelligence exposure. What if it's a trap? What if Delcy's actual objective is to lure FBI personnel into a compromised position in Caracas and then publicize American law enforcement operating illegally on Venezuelan soil? The FBI's due diligence on this took approximately 6 weeks. They ran Delcy's bona fides through every available intelligence channel. They cross-referenced the technical specifications she provided against their own SIGINT collection on Saab's compound. They ran tabletop exercises on what a trap scenario would look like versus what a genuine cooperation offer would look like. What convinced them was verification. Delcy didn't just offer information. She provided testable intelligence. In December 2025, her intermediaries provided the FBI with the access codes to one of Saab's secondary financial servers, a system hosting encrypted backups of offshore transaction records. The FBI was able to verify remote access to that server without triggering any security alerts. That was the proof of capability. If Delcy could provide working credentials to a secured financial system, she could deliver on the larger promise. The operational agreement was finalized in early January 2026. Delcy would provide a specific window of opportunity, a date when Saab would be at his Cerro Verde compound with minimal external security augmentation. She would also provide the master firmware keys to bypass the biometric locks and the authentication codes to loop the CCTV surveillance feeds. In exchange, the FBI would execute the arrest as a unilateral American operation with no public acknowledgement of Venezuelan government cooperation. But Delcy added one additional requirement. Raúl Gorrín had to be taken in the same operation. Gorrín, the media mogul turned money launderer, represented another node in the old financial network. He wasn't as operationally critical as Saab, but he was politically connected and had extensive compromat on multiple regime officials. Taking him off the board simultaneously with Saab would decapitate 2 major vectors of potential resistance to Delcy's consolidation. The FBI agreed. From their perspective, getting 2 high-value targets in one operation was a force multiplier. They didn't particularly care about Delcy's internal political motivations. Their objective was arresting individuals under federal indictment. If a Venezuelan government official wanted to facilitate that for her own reasons, that was operationally advantageous. What neither Saab nor Gorrín understood in early February 2026 was that their security apparatus had already been compromised at the architectural level. The systems they trusted were operating under protocols that had been rewritten by the very people assigned to protect them. They weren't just vulnerable, they were already neutralized. They just didn't know it yet. The SEBIN officers assigned to Saab's protective detail reported to commanders who reported to Delcy. The firmware updates pushed to the compound's security grid in January 2026, ostensibly to patch vulnerabilities, actually introduced backdoor access points. The Cuban security advisors providing training to Saab's personal guards were never informed that SEBIN had reclassified Saab's status from protected asset to acceptable loss. By the time February 4th arrived, the operation wasn't a breach. It was an execution of a pre-authorized protocol. The compound's defenses didn't fail. They performed exactly as Delcy had reprogrammed them to perform, by opening the doors for the FBI. This is what we mean by managed betrayal. This wasn't espionage. This wasn't penetration. This was an inside actor weaponizing the security apparatus against its own principle. And from a pure counterintelligence perspective, it's almost impossible to defend against, because the threat isn't external. The threat is the system itself. Now let me take you inside the compound and show you exactly how that system was engineered to fail. Alex Saab's primary residence in Cerro Verde wasn't selected for its views or its proximity to Caracas's diplomatic quarter. It was selected for its defensibility. The compound sits on elevated terrain with clear sightlines in all directions. Classic high-ground defensive posture. The perimeter wall is 3 meters high, reinforced concrete with embedded steel rebar. The main structure is set back 40 meters from the perimeter, creating a kill zone that any assault force would have to cross under direct observation. On paper, this is a tactically sound defensive architecture. In practice, in early 2026, it represented one of the most sophisticated private security installations in Latin America. Let me walk you through the layered defense grid that Saab believed made him untouchable. Layer 1. Electronic warfare countermeasures. The compound was equipped with Russian-manufactured Pol-21 electronic warfare systems, the same platform the Russian military uses for battlefield communications disruption. These systems create a localized electromagnetic bubble that jams GPS signals, disrupts radio communications, and interferes with drone navigation systems. The operational objective is to blind any electronic surveillance and prevent coordinated assault team communications within a 300-meter radius of the compound. For most law enforcement, or even military units, this represents a serious problem. If your communications go dark and your GPS navigation fails the moment you approach the target, your operational tempo collapses. You're forced to rely on line-of-sight communications and manual navigation, which degrades tactical coordination and increases response time to developing threats. Saab security consultants, we believe they were former Russian GRU contractors operating through a private security firm registered in Dubai, configured the Pol-21 systems to activate automatically when the perimeter sensors detected unauthorized approach vectors. The idea was to create an automated defensive response that didn't require human decision-making. The system would detect a threat and immediately deny that threat the use of modern communications and navigation technology. Layer 2. Biometric access control. Every entrance point to the main structure was secured with Chinese-manufactured facial recognition and fingerprint scanning systems. These weren't commercial off-the-shelf products. These were military-grade systems designed for high-security government facilities. The facial recognition database contained authorized personnel only. Approximately 35 individuals, including household staff, security personnel, and Saab's immediate family. The system was configured with anti-spoofing protocols. It couldn't be defeated with a photograph or a silicone fingerprint replica. It required live biometric data verified against multiple parameters: skin temperature, micro-expressions, blood flow patterns in the fingertips, If the system detected a spoof attempt, it would trigger a lockdown protocol that sealed all entry points and activated the compound's panic room protocols. The access control system wasn't just defensive, it was also surveillance. Every biometric scan was logged with timestamp and location data. The system maintained a complete record of who entered which areas of the compound and when. This created an audit trail that could detect unauthorized access patterns or potential insider threats. Layer 3. Cuban-trained security detail. Saab's personal protection team consisted of 12 individuals, all Venezuelan nationals, but all trained by Cuban intelligence advisors with backgrounds in executive protection and counterintelligence. This wasn't mall security. These were individuals with military backgrounds, combat experience, and training in advanced surveillance detection and counter-assault tactics. The detail operated on a rotational shift pattern that ensured at least 8 personnel were on active duty at any given time. 4 roving perimeter guards. 2 static guards at the main entrance. 2 close protection officers inside the residence with direct access to Saab. The remaining 4 were off-duty but on-site, able to respond within 90 seconds if an alert was triggered. Each guard was equipped with encrypted radio communications, body armor, and select-fire weapons. The standard loadout was a Kalashnikov pattern rifle with spare magazines, a sidearm, and less lethal options for dealing with non-hostile intrusions. The radio network was separate from the compound's main communications grid, a redundant system designed to maintain tactical coordination even if the primary infrastructure was compromised. Layer 4. CCTV and motion detection grid. The compound had 47 cameras providing overlapping coverage of all approach vectors, the perimeter wall, the grounds, and every entrance point to the main structure. The cameras fed into a central monitoring station staffed 24 hours with dedicated security personnel whose sole job was to watch the feeds and identify potential threats. The system wasn't just passive recording. It incorporated AI-driven motion detection algorithms that could differentiate between normal activity, delivery personnel, household staff movement, wildlife, and anomalous patterns that might indicate reconnaissance or preparation for an assault. If the system detected an anomalous pattern, it would alert the monitoring station and automatically increase the recording frame rate for that camera zone. The footage was stored on redundant servers with 48 hours of rolling coverage. The servers were housed in a climate-controlled, electromagnetically shielded room in the compound's basement, protected against both physical intrusion and electronic interference. Layer 5. Direct SEBIN liaison. This was the crown jewel of Saab's security architecture. He had a dedicated communications link to SEBIN command. If the compound came under threat, a single encrypted call would bring Venezuelan state security forces to his location within 15 minutes. Not local police, not National Guard. SEBIN, the regime's primary counterintelligence and internal security apparatus. From Saab's perspective, this was the ultimate insurance policy. The electronic warfare systems, the biometrics, the trained guards, all of that was designed to buy time. The real security was the knowledge that he was a protected asset of the Venezuelan state, and any threat to him was a threat to the regime's financial infrastructure. That assessment was correct, until it wasn't. What Saab didn't know in early February 2026 was that every layer of his defensive architecture had been systematically compromised through firmware-level access provided by SEBIN itself. The Russian EW systems, the Chinese biometric locks, the CCTV network, all of it ran on software that had been updated in January with patches that included backdoor access protocols. The POL 21 jamming systems could be remotely deactivated. The biometric locks could be bypassed with override codes. The CCTV feeds could be looped to show recorded footage instead of live surveillance. And the direct SEBIN liaison? That line now connected to the very people who had decided Saab was no longer an asset worth protecting. The fortress wasn't breached. It was reprogrammed. And that reprogramming was invisible to everyone inside the compound, because it existed at a level of the system architecture that the security personnel didn't even know existed. This is the nature of modern betrayal. It's not about picking locks or climbing walls. It's about owning the code that controls the locks and walls. And SEBIN owned that code because they had provided it in the first place. Now we get into the technical core of how Operation Broken Vault was executed. What I'm about to describe is what we're internally calling the Shadow Protocol, the systematic exploitation of firmware-level backdoors to create the appearance of a functional security system while rendering it completely inert. The operation commenced at 03:47 hours local time on February 4, 2026. The FBI's hostage rescue team, operating under cover of darkness with Venezuelan government authorization that Saab's security detail knew nothing about, established staging positions approximately 400 meters from the compound perimeter. Standard HRT assault doctrine would call for a rapid breach, explosive charges on the gate, simultaneous multi-point entry, overwhelming speed and violence of action to collapse the defensive posture before organized resistance could form. But that's not what happened here. This wasn't a forced entry. This was a technical infiltration enabled by complete control of the compound's defensive systems. At 03:52 hours, a SEBIN cyber operations team working from a secure facility in Caracas under Delcy Rodriguez's direct authority initiated the Shadow Protocol. The first target was the POL 21 electronic warfare system. The firmware backdoor allowed them to send a remote deactivation command disguised as a routine diagnostic check. The system accepted the command, ran a false diagnostic that reported normal operation, and then went into standby mode. From the perspective of anyone monitoring the system status panel inside the compound's security room, everything looked normal. Green lights across the board. System active. But the electromagnetic jamming field had collapsed. The FBI's tactical communications network was now fully operational. Their GPS navigation systems were receiving clear satellite signals. Their drone reconnaissance platforms could operate within the compound's airspace without interference. The defensive perimeter had just been silently neutralized, and nobody inside the compound knew it. At 03:55 hours, the Shadow Protocol targeted the CCTV network. This was more sophisticated than simple deactivation. Shutting down the cameras would trigger immediate alerts. Instead, the SEBIN cyber team executed a feed loop protocol. They isolated a 30-minute segment of recorded footage from the previous night, a period of normal, uneventful perimeter activity, and fed that footage into the monitoring station's display system, while simultaneously recording the actual live feed to a separate, hidden data stream. The security personnel watching the monitors saw exactly what they expected to see: empty perimeter, routine patrol patterns, no anomalous activity. What they didn't see was the HRT assault element moving into final approach positions, cutting through the perimeter fence at a section that had been identified through the blueprints SEBIN provided, and establishing entry points at 3 locations around the main structure. This is the psychological component of the Shadow Protocol. The defenders aren't just neutralized, they're deceived into believing they're still defended. They're looking at screens that tell them everything is normal, while the attack is already inside their perimeter. At 03:58 hours, the HRT reached the main structure's entrance points. This is where the biometric access control should have stopped them cold. Without authorized biometric credentials, those locks shouldn't open. Attempting to force them should trigger the lockdown protocol and activate the compound's panic room defenses. But the Shadow Protocol had already rewritten the access control firmware. The SEBIN cyber team transmitted a series of master override codes, essentially administrative backdoor credentials that the system's designers had built in for maintenance and emergency access. These codes bypassed the biometric verification entirely and unlocked the doors as if they had received valid, authenticated access. From the perspective of the Access Control System's audit log, nothing unusual happened. The log recorded standard door openings with generic system-authorized timestamps. No failed authentication attempts. No forced entry alerts. The doors just opened. The HRT entered the compound at 3 points simultaneously. No explosions. No alarms. The electronic defenses that should have detected, alerted, and delayed them had been surgically disabled while maintaining the appearance of normal operation. Now let's talk about the human element, the Cuban-trained security detail. These are the individuals who should have provided the last line of defense, but their effectiveness was compromised before the operation even began. At 03:59 hours, the Shadow Protocol executed its final component. Communications disruption targeted specifically at the security detail's encrypted radio network. Remember, this was a separate system from the compound's main infrastructure, a redundancy designed to maintain tactical coordination even if everything else failed. But that redundancy was illusory. The radios operated on encrypted frequencies, but those frequencies had been provided to the FBI through SEBIN liaison. More critically, the encryption keys had been provided as well. The HRT didn't just jam the security detail's communications. They spoofed them. As the HRT moved through the compound, they transmitted false radio traffic on the security detail's frequency. Routine check-ins, normal status reports, no alerts. The guards heard what sounded like their colleagues reporting all clear status. They had no reason to believe anything was wrong. The perimeter guards were neutralized first. The HRT used suppressed weapons and less lethal options. This wasn't a kill mission. It was an arrest operation. The guards were compromised before they could transmit any alert because the radios they were reaching for were already under FBI control, broadcasting false, normal status traffic. The close protection officers inside the residence with Saab were the last to realize what was happening. And by the time they did, it was already over. The HRT breached Saab's personal quarters at 04:03 hours, 16 minutes after initiating the Shadow Protocol. Saab's reaction, according to the FBI's Operational After-Action Report, was immediate comprehension. He didn't resist. He didn't attempt to reach a panic button or a secure room. He looked at the HRT operators, then at his own security personnel who had been outmaneuvered and neutralized, and he understood. This wasn't an American intelligence penetration. This was an inside job. The defenses hadn't failed. They had been turned off. And the only people who could turn them off were the people who had installed them. SEBIN. The arrest was executed with clinical precision. Saab was secured, his personal devices confiscated, and the compound's servers, the ones containing the offshore transaction ledgers and encrypted financial records, were imaged and prepared for transport. At 04:07 hours, a second HRT element executed a simultaneous raid on Raúl Gorrín's residence in the Country Club district. The same Shadow Protocol, the same firmware-level compromises, the same result. Gorrín was secured without resistance, his defensive infrastructure neutralized before he even knew he was under attack. By 04:15 hours, both high-value targets were in FBI custody and being transported to a secure location. The entire operation, from initial breach to final extraction, lasted 28 minutes. From a technical perspective, this represents near-perfect execution of a digitally enabled kinetic operation. But from a counterintelligence perspective, what's most striking is what didn't happen. There was no firefight, no standoff, no dramatic final resistance. Because you can't fight a threat you can't see, and you can't defend against a system that's been programmed to betray you. The fortress didn't fall. It opened its gates and welcomed the attack inside. Let me walk you through the terminal phase of the operation, The 9 minutes between the HRT's final approach and the moment Alex Saab realized his entire security architecture had been compromised from within. 0358 hours. The HRT assault element is in final staging position, 40 meters from the main structure. At this point, standard defensive doctrine should have already detected them. The motion sensors should have triggered. The perimeter cameras should have flagged the anomalous movement patterns. The roving guards should have visually identified the threat. None of that happened because the guards were looking at looped footage showing an empty compound perimeter from 90 minutes earlier. The motion sensors had been selectively disabled in the specific zones where the HRT was maneuvering. The entire detection grid had been geographically carved out to create blind corridors of approach, and those corridors were only visible to someone with access to the system's master control architecture. The HRT moved through those corridors like they owned them. Because, in a functional sense, they did. SEBIN had provided the blueprints. They knew where every sensor was. They knew the camera coverage angles. They knew the patrol patterns. This wasn't infiltration. This was navigation through pre-authorized pathways. 0359 hours. The first guard goes down. One of the perimeter security personnel conducting a routine patrol walks directly into an HRT operator positioned in what should have been a covered sector. The guard reaches for his radio to call in the contact. He presses the transmit button, and what comes out isn't his voice. It's a pre-recorded segment of his own voice from earlier in the shift, confirming all clear status on his sector. That's when the first micro-level psychological fracture occurs. The guard hears his own voice on the radio saying everything's fine while he's staring at an armed tactical operator pointing a suppressed weapon at his chest. That moment of cognitive dissonance, the gap between what his senses are telling him and what the radio is telling him, creates a 2-second delay in his response cycle. 2 seconds is an eternity in close-quarters tactical operations. The guard is neutralized, flex-cuffed, and moved to a secure holding position before his brain finishes processing what just happened. He never gets off a genuine alert. This pattern repeats across all 4 perimeter guards. Each one is isolated, neutralized, and silenced before they can transmit meaningful warning. The HRT isn't just faster. They're operating with knowledge of where each guard is, what their radio check-in schedule is, and when they'll be most vulnerable to isolation. 0401 hours. The HRT reaches the main entrance. This is the critical bottleneck. The biometric access control system. In any normal scenario, this is where the assault stalls. You can't spoof biometrics in real time. You can't fake the system's liveness detection. You either have an authorized individual with you, or you're forced to go kinetic. Breaching charges, forced entry, alarms triggering, panic room protocols activating. But when the HRT presents the master override codes that exist in the system's firmware at a level that the security personnel don't even know about, the door simply unlocks. No alarms, no alerts. The system's audit log records a routine administrative access. The door mechanism cycles through its normal unlock sequence, and the HRT walks in like they have an appointment. Inside the residence, the 2 close protection officers are positioned in accordance with their standard protocol. One is stationed outside Saab's personal quarters. One is monitoring the internal CCTV feeds from the ground floor security station. Both are armed. Both are trained to respond to intrusion scenarios, but neither of them receives any warning because the CCTV feeds they're watching show an empty, secure compound. The perimeter guards they're expecting to hear from on the radio net are transmitting false, all-clear signals. From their perspective, it's a routine early morning shift. Nothing happening. No alerts. System status green across the board. The HRT ascending the main staircase towards Saab's quarters is invisible to them because the cameras that should show that staircase are playing looped footage from an hour earlier. 040, 2 hours. The close protection officer stationed outside Saab's door hears footsteps. He turns, expecting to see household staff or possibly Saab himself exiting the room. Instead, he sees 4 HRT operators in full tactical kit, weapons raised, moving with absolute precision and speed. His training takes over. He reaches for his sidearm, but before his hand reaches the holster, he hears a voice on his radio, his team leader's voice, transmitting a stand-down order. Except his team leader is on the other side of the compound, already neutralized and secured. That voice is FBI, spoofing the radio net with pre-recorded command traffic. And that 3-second pause, the moment where the guard's brain tries to reconcile the contradiction between the armed operators in front of him and the stand-down order in his ear, is enough. He's neutralized, disarmed, and secured without discharging a single round. The second close protection officer in the ground floor security station realizes something is wrong when he sees armed personnel on the staircase camera feed, but that feed only switches back to live mode after the HRT has already secured the first officer. He reaches for the panic button that should trigger lockdown and summon SEBIN rapid response. He presses the button. The system acknowledges the input, and nothing happens. Because the panic button's output has been rerouted through the shadow protocol to a null endpoint. The signal goes nowhere. SEBIN command receives no alert because SEBIN command already knows this operation is happening. They authorized it. 040, 3 hours. The HRT breaches Saab's personal quarters. He's awake. The operational tempo of boots on stairs and terse command voices carries through the door. But he's not reaching for a weapon or activating any defense protocol. He's sitting on the edge of his bed, hands visible, posture non-threatening. The HRT operators later reported that Saab's first words were not a question. He didn't ask who they were or what they wanted. He asked in Spanish, "Who gave you the codes?" That's the moment of recognition. Saab is a sophisticated actor. He understands operational security. He knows his compound's defensive architecture, and he knows that architecture can't be defeated from the outside without catastrophic failures that should have given him warning and time. The fact that the HRT is standing in his bedroom, that his guards never transmitted an alert, that the biometric locks opened for unauthorized personnel, there's only one explanation. The codes were provided. The access was authorized, and the only people who could authorize that access were the people who designed the security grid in the first place. SEBIN, which means Delcy, which means he's not just been arrested, he's been abandoned, purged, neutralized by his own side. The HRT secures Saab without resistance. They confiscate his personal devices, 3 encrypted smartphones, a tablet, a laptop. More critically, they access the concealed floor safe that contains the physical hardware wallets and encrypted USB drives holding the cryptographic keys to his offshore financial infrastructure. That safe should have been invisible to anyone without prior knowledge of its location. But SEBIN provided the compound blueprints, including the modifications Saab made after initial construction. The FBI knew where the safe was. They knew the make and model. They brought the tools to open it. 040, 7 hours. While the primary HRT element is securing Saab, the secondary element hits Raúl Gorrín's residence 8 kilometers away in the country club district. Same protocol, same firmware-level compromises. Gorrín's compound has different hardware, different camera systems, different access control, but the principle is identical. SEBIN provided the master keys. The shadow protocol created the same synthetic blind spots and false normal status indicators. Gorrín's security detail is neutralized with the same efficiency. He's secured in his bedroom. His servers are imaged. His personal devices confiscated. And just like Saab, Gorrín's reaction isn't confusion, it's comprehension. These aren't random arrests. This is a coordinated decapitation authorized from within the regime. 0412 hours. Both high-value targets are secured, packaged, and being moved to extraction vehicles. The entire operation from breach to extraction, 9 minutes. No shots fired, no casualties, no dramatic standoff. Just clinical, surgical execution enabled by complete system compromise. By 0420 hours, Saab and Gorrín are in transit to the FBI's secure facility at the U.S. diplomatic compound. And back at Miraflores Palace, Delcy Rodriguez is receiving confirmation that the operation was successful. 2 major nodes of the old financial network have been severed. The consolidation can proceed. The regime's official statement, issued 6 hours later, condemned the operation as a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty and an illegal incursion by U.S. law enforcement. But no SEBIN rapid response team was dispatched to intercept the extraction. No diplomatic protest was filed immediately. No emergency session of the Venezuelan National Assembly was convened. Because everyone who needed to know already knew this operation wasn't a violation. It was a collaboration. The outrage was performative. The real message was being delivered internally to the remaining members of the old financial network. Nobody is untouchable. Not if the people who control the security apparatus decide you're a liability. That's the ultimate psychological effect of Operation Broken Vault. It's not just that 2 individuals were arrested, it's that the arrest demonstrated that the most sophisticated private security infrastructure money can buy is meaningless if the state-level actors who designed it decide to turn it against you. You can't defend against a threat that controls your defenses. Now let's discuss what the FBI actually captured when they imaged Saab's servers and seized his encrypted hardware wallets. Because the operational value of Operation Broken Vault wasn't just removing 2 individuals from the regime's financial network. It was decapitating the network's institutional memory and capturing the architectural documentation of how that network functions. The primary target was a server array housed in Saab's compound basement, what his security consultants had marketed as a quantum-safe storage solution. That terminology is mostly marketing nonsense. There's no such thing as quantum-safe storage in 2026 except in classified government labs. What Saab actually had was a high-end encrypted storage system using AES 256 encryption with hardware security modules for key management. Solid encryption. Properly implemented, it would take centuries of conventional computing power to crack. But the FBI didn't need to crack it, because when they seized the hardware wallets from Saab's floor safe, they seized the decryption keys. This is the fundamental vulnerability in any encrypted system. The encryption itself might be mathematically unbreakable, but if you can access the keys, and if those keys are stored physically rather than memorized, then the encryption is irrelevant. And Saab, like most individuals managing complex financial networks, couldn't memorize dozens of high-entropy encryption keys. He stored them on hardware wallets, believing the wallet's own security features would protect them. Those wallets were designed to resist physical tampering. Attempting to open them without the correct PIN would trigger a data wipe. But the FBI's cyber forensics team didn't need to tamper with them. Because SEBIN had provided Saab's PIN codes, obtained through physical surveillance of him accessing the devices over the previous months, the wallets unlocked, the keys were extracted, and the servers that contained the financial records were decrypted in situ during the raid. What was on those servers represents the most comprehensive documentation of sanctions evasion financial architecture that U.S. law enforcement has captured from a Venezuelan target. Let me walk you through the categories of data. First, offshore corporate structures. Saab maintained detailed records of over 400 shell corporations registered across 17 jurisdictions. These weren't just company names and registration numbers. These were complete operational files, beneficial ownership documentation, banking relationships, transaction histories, and most critically, the network maps showing how these entities connected to each other and to Venezuelan state assets. This is the kind of documentation that takes years of financial intelligence collection to reconstruct. It maps out the entire supply chain of sanctions evasion, how Venezuelan oil revenue moves through Turkish intermediaries, gets laundered through UAE real estate transactions, and eventually ends up in European banks or cryptocurrency exchanges. Second, cryptocurrency infrastructure. Saab was an early adopter of crypto as a sanctions evasion tool, but he maintained operational security practices that are increasingly rare. He kept complete records of wallet addresses, exchange accounts, mixer services, and the privacy protocols he used to obscure transaction trails. Most sophisticated cryptocurrency users deliberately don't keep records, precisely because those records create evidence trails. But Saab was managing financial flows for an entire regime. He needed documentation to track where money was, who controlled it, and how to access it if primary channels were compromised. That need for operational continuity overrode ideal security practices. The FBI now has a comprehensive map of the regime's cryptocurrency holdings, estimated at approximately $800 million, distributed across multiple blockchains and exchange platforms. More importantly, they have the private keys to a substantial portion of those holdings. Saab didn't just document where the money was, he maintained the access credentials. Third, compromat and leverage files. This is where the intelligence value transcends financial crime and enters strategic counterintelligence territory. Saab maintained detailed files on Venezuelan government officials, foreign business partners, and intermediaries in the sanctions evasion network. These files documented who was receiving bribes, who was facilitating money laundering, and who had compromised themselves through their association with the regime. The files include communications, encrypted messages, emails, transaction records that document specific corrupt acts. This is leverage material. It's the documentation you maintain when you need to ensure cooperation or silence from individuals who might otherwise become liabilities. The FBI has now inherited Saab's leverage files. They know who in the Venezuelan government was receiving payments. They know which foreign bankers were facilitating transactions. They know which corporate executives in supposedly legitimate companies were knowingly doing business with sanctioned entities. This creates cascading counterintelligence opportunities. Every individual documented in those files is now potentially subject to prosecution, or, more usefully, recruitment. You don't necessarily want to arrest everyone. Sometimes you want to flip them, offer immunity or reduced charges in exchange for cooperation and ongoing intelligence access. Fourth, the oil for gold infrastructure. This was Saab's signature innovation, the mechanism by which Venezuelan oil revenue was converted to gold, physically transported to UAE and Turkish refineries, and then sold into legitimate commodities markets with the proceeds laundered through the Shell Corporation network. The server contained complete documentation of this supply chain: the tanker companies, the refinery contacts, the freight forwarders, the customs brokers who facilitated the physical movement, the banking institutions that handled the financial transactions. Dismantling this infrastructure requires more than just arresting Saab. It requires rolling up the entire network of intermediaries and service providers. The FBI now has the targeting package to do exactly that. Every entity in the supply chain is documented. Every transaction is traceable. But here's what's strategically most significant about the digital autopsy. It's not just what the FBI captured. It's what the remaining regime officials now know the FBI captured. Maduro and his inner circle understand that Saab maintained comprehensive records. They understand that those records documented their personal involvement in sanctions evasion schemes, corruption, and money laundering. And they now have to operate under the assumption that the FBI has all of it. That assumption creates paralysis. Every regime official who knows they're documented in Saab's files now has to consider whether they're a target for arrest if they travel outside Venezuela. They have to consider whether their foreign bank accounts might be seized. They have to consider whether foreign business partners who were facilitating their schemes will continue to do business with them now that U.S. law enforcement has detailed evidence of those schemes. This is strategic decapitation through information capture. You don't need to arrest everyone. You just need to capture the documentation that proves their crimes, and let them live with the knowledge that you have it. The psychological impact on the remaining financial network has been observable through SIGINT collection over the past weeks. Encrypted communications between regime officials and foreign intermediaries have spiked. Everyone's trying to assess their exposure and determine who else might be compromised. Foreign bank accounts associated with regime officials are being rapidly moved or closed. Business relationships that operated in legal gray areas are being terminated. The network isn't just damaged, it's fragmenting under the weight of uncertainty about what the FBI knows and who they'll target next. And that fragmentation serves Delsey's consolidation objectives perfectly. The old guard that depended on Saab's infrastructure is now scrambling to protect themselves. They're not in a position to resist Delsey's new financial architecture. They're too busy managing their own legal exposure. From an intelligence perspective, Operation Broken Vault achieved something rare. It simultaneously served U.S. law enforcement objectives and internal Venezuelan power consolidation objectives. The FBI gets high-value arrests and comprehensive financial intelligence. Delsey gets elimination of her political rivals and validation of her new power structure. The only losers are Saab and Gorrín, who are now facing decades in U.S. federal prison, and the regime officials whose corruption is now comprehensively documented in FBI evidence files. But the broader strategic message is clear. In modern financial warfare, physical security is irrelevant if your own side decides you're expendable. You can build the most sophisticated compound, employ the best security personnel, and encrypt your data with unbreakable algorithms, and all of it becomes meaningless if the people who designed your security infrastructure decide to give your enemies the keys. That's not a failure of technology. That's a failure of trust in a system where trust is the only thing that actually matters. Let me give you the final assessment on Operation Broken Vault and what it tells us about the evolution of state-sponsored betrayal in the digital age. What happened on February 4, 2026, wasn't an intelligence breakthrough. It wasn't superior American surveillance technology or deep-cover CIA penetration of the Venezuelan regime. It was a deliberate handoff of protected assets by a senior regime official pursuing internal power consolidation. Delsey Rodriguez identified two individuals who represented institutional memory and financial leverage that threatened her control. She couldn't remove them directly without triggering internal political backlash, so she weaponized U.S. law enforcement to do it for her, providing the access codes, bypasses, and master keys necessary to neutralize security infrastructure that SEBIN itself had designed and installed. From a pure operational perspective, this represents near-perfect execution of a managed betrayal. The FBI achieved arrests they've been pursuing for years. Delsey eliminated rivals and consolidated power, and the regime maintains plausible deniability by publicly condemning the operation as American aggression while privately authorizing every element of it. But the strategic implications go beyond this specific operation. What Operation Broken Vault demonstrates is that in modern security architecture, firmware-level access is absolute power. It doesn't matter how sophisticated your physical security is, if the people who control the software can rewrite the rules in real time. Saab and Gorrín believed they were protected by walls, guards, biometric locks, and state patronage. They were actually protected by nothing except Delsey's ongoing assessment of their utility. The moment that assessment changed, every layer of their defensive infrastructure became a weapon turned against them. This is the new landscape of high-value targeting in authoritarian regimes. The threat isn't external penetration. The threat is internal abandonment. And you can't defend against abandonment with better encryption or more guards. You can only defend against it by remaining politically indispensable. Saab and Gorrín were no longer indispensable, so they were expended. For the remaining members of the Venezuelan regime's financial network, the lesson is clear. Your security is an illusion, maintained only as long as it serves someone else's interests. The moment those interests change, the fortress becomes a prison, and the guards become your captors. For U.S. intelligence and law enforcement, Operation Broken Vault validates a new operational model. High-value targets in authoritarian states may be more accessible through cooperation with internal factions than through external penetration. The challenge is identifying which regime officials have incentives to cooperate and what they want in exchange. For the broader intelligence community, this operation should trigger reassessment of defensive assumptions. If your security infrastructure is designed and maintained by state-level actors, even allied state-level actors, you need to assume that infrastructure can be compromised at the firmware level, with no visible indicators of compromise. There's no such thing as a trusted system. There are only systems you haven't yet discovered are compromised. Final assessment. Operation Broken Vault was a tactical success with strategic implications for how we understand modern betrayal architecture. The age of impenetrable fortresses is over. We've entered the age of programmable security, where defenses can be enabled or disabled remotely by whoever controls the master keys. And in Venezuela, on February 4, 2026, Delcy Rodriguez demonstrated that she controls those keys.